President and members, I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business to take up and consider at this time Senate Bill 16. Some of us will recall Senate Bill 3 during the second special session of the 87th legislature, the last time we were here, back in 2021, and it banned the exposure and teaching of critical race theory in K through 12 public schools. Now, you may recall that bill did not use the phrase critical race theory because the concern is those ideas that one race is superior or inferior to another, or those ideas that one gender, one sex is superior to another. Those are the ideas that, of course, have no place being taught in Texas public schools. Since then, however, since that ban on critical race theory in K through 12, it's become apparent this teaching is prevalent in higher education institutions as well. In fact, some of you may have read the story about a year ago. UT Faculty Council passes resolution supporting freedom to teach critical race theory. Now, I bet you've heard that critical race theory is some obscure doctrine. It's only taught in law schools. Yet again, this is UT faculty. We're talking about the undergraduate university. Council passes resolution supporting freedom to teach critical race theory. Just one example of the concerns about this being taught in our higher education institutions. Now, we recognize in higher education, we're out of high school and we're adults now, or almost adults legally, and we recognize and we cherish the idea that at our higher institutions of learning that different ideas are presented. Students are exposed to ideas from across the spectrum to develop their own thinking and develop their own analytical skills and come up with their own views, their own ways of looking at things. And that's important. In fact, to make clear how important that is, Senate Bill 16 would establish an express purpose statement for public institutions of higher education. The Texas public institutions of higher ed should be committed to creating environments where students are equipped for participation in the workforce and society while also respecting intellectual diversity and not indoctrinating students. This bill would prohibit faculty from compelling or attempting to compel students to adopt a belief that any race, sex, or ethnicity, or social, political, or religious belief is inherently superior to any other race, sex, ethnicity, or belief. SB16 also addresses the growing attempt to revise history and shape students' intellectual and moral beliefs based upon political ideology. The idea here is to protect academic freedom, to make sure that students can be exposed to a broad range of ideas and challenged, but to make it very clear, to make it crystal clear that professors are not to compel or attempt to compel students to adopt the professor's viewpoint. That's what the bill's about. I'm sure we'll have a good discussion about it. We do have a floor amendment, should the Senate see fit to suspend and allow the bill to go forward. We'll have a floor amendment to discuss at that time. But that's what the bill's about. That's what the bill does. And I move suspension of the Senate's regular order of business.
Senator Menendez, what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if the gentleman would yield for some questions.
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you. So, Mr. Hughes, I think you said in your layout, you're committed to create an environment of intellectual inquiry, academic freedom, so all students are equipped for participation. Is that correct? I think that's straight out of the bill. Is that not correct?
Senator, that's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. So, why would the legislature seek to censor discussions about certain topics that might be deemed inappropriate by certain legislators rather than defer to the expertise of the people teaching the courses?
Senator, let me be clear. Nothing in Senate Bill 16 censors discussions of any topics. I'm glad you said that. That's not what this bill's about, not in the bill. In fact, the bill specifically says that we are for intellectual diversity so that all students are respected and educated.
So, let's see here. Our colleges, as you and I both agree, colleges and universities are central to safeguarding the ideas of critical thinking, academic freedom. These ideals and the pursuit of truth through research are paramount to democracy. It can be said otherwise that higher education institutions are anchors for democracy. And so America's system of higher ed is recognized globally for this. So could you discuss what consideration was given for how Senate Bill 16 could negatively impact our democracy and the guardrails that you will institute to ensure you do not erode this essential role of institutions in higher education?
Senator, of course, we recognize, of course, that higher education is a different setting than K through 12. Higher education students are exposed to different ideas. I'm sure that many people on this floor who went to school after high school, who went through higher education, read a lot of texts that they did not agree with and heard lectures from professors they did not agree with. I certainly did. I bet you did too. You went to a great school. I know that's part of the process, and that's part of what higher education is about. I think we all agree on that, and that's why, Senator, that we expressly put this higher education purpose statement. Maybe we just took this for granted before, but it needs to be in statute that public higher education must be committed to creating an environment of intellectual inquiry and academic freedom so that all students are equipped. So that's important. That needs, I bet we agree on that part. That needs to be in statute, just to make it clear. We are for that.
Right.
What we are not for, well, I think we would agree. What we are not for is when that professor compels or attempts to compel a student to adopt a certain belief. Do we lecture about different ideas, different theories? You bet, of course. But to require adherence to the professor's viewpoint, to a certain viewpoint, that's another matter entirely. That's what this bill's about.
And while I agree with you that nowhere should we try to compel people to force them how to think or act the way we believe is right, one of the concerns is that there's a lack of clarity on how the law would be implemented. And so I feel currently the bill is very broad, and I'm not sure what are the mechanisms for enforcement. I believe that the passage of Senate Bill 3 has led to the State Board's education reconsideration of its social studies curriculum. During this last effort last summer, a group of educators proposed that second grade social studies lessons should refer to slavery as involuntary relocation. I quote, involuntary relocation. They were asked to reconsider their phrasing rather than unequivocal repudiation of such a disturbing and offensive suggestion. What was that the proposal in alignment with or a misinterpretation of the current CRT law? That's the concern that I have, because there are certain facts that are this is going to have an impact on teaching the truth about certain dark chapters in our history, such as slavery, possibly the Holocaust, places and areas, maybe the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, maybe the Civil Rights Movement. So there are so many areas that I'm concerned that this bill will create further confusion, and it will create a sense of censorship. And so what are the mechanisms for enforcement in your legislation?
Senator, let me address the points you raised. You talked about the State Board of Education redeveloping standards for social studies. To be clear, they were in the process of doing that. That was their decision, separate from the House and Senate passing Senate Bill 3 signed by the governor. As you recall, and you and I discussed Senate Bill 3 lengthy on this floor, we specifically put in Senate Bill 3 that all of those elements in the TEKS must be taught. And as you'll recall, in our current TEKS, those Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, those elements of our curriculum, you'll recall in the current ones, Dr. King is mentioned as many times as George Washington. And there's material about difficult things, horrible things in our past, like slavery, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Jim Crow era, and yes, the Holocaust. Hard, difficult, dark things. Those are required to be taught in Texas public schools, K through 12. They were required before Senate Bill 3. They are still required today. Now, you and I had a lot of discussion about this, and I think we would agree that the language of Senate Bill 3 specifically says you must teach those elements in the TEKS. Now, if someone read a news story about the bill or read a comment made by a politician about the bill, they might be confused and might think that means don't talk about difficult things. But Senate Bill 3, that ban on teaching that one sex is superior or inferior, or one race is superior or inferior, it specifically said in the version that you and I worked on, it specifically said, we will teach all of these elements in the TEKS, the difficult things, the dark things, the hard things. Those must be taught. And so I had a lot of discussions about this after the bill took effect. But in fact, I went to the State Board of Education and we talked about some of these very things. So I think we're clear on that, but I hope no one watching is confused. Senate Bill 3, passed last legislature, signed by the governor, requires teaching of difficult, dark things in our past and teaching how we got past those things, as you and I know, by coming together as Americans. So I hope we're clear on that. I wouldn't want to confuse anybody who's watching about what was in Senate Bill 3, in fairness.
I'm not disputing that. What I'm asking is, what is the mechanism for enforcement when you find an egregious example of someone saying that something was an involuntary relocation, which is a complete, objectionable, repudiating statement, ignoring a dark chapter in our history. And I'm just saying, how are you going to enforce this law if this bill passes into law?
Okay, so what you described about that horrible misstating what slavery was, that obviously has no place in Texas, and I don't think that made it into the new.
I'm not sure that it did.
You tell me if it did.
Yeah, I'm not sure that.
If it did, you and I'll go over there together, and we'll both talk to him about that, because that has no place in our curriculum. You know that. Correct. As far as, but to answer your question about enforcement, for this bill, I have a floor amendment that does a couple things, and we can talk in more detail, but it requires the Board of Regents to set up a system for student complaints and for handling those complaints. And we can, if we get that far, I do have an amendment that deals with the enforcement part. I bet you'll have questions about it, I'm sure.
Okay, so your answer is current legislation is not going to be what you hope the final bill has for a mechanism, because that bill is coming, the mechanisms in the amendment.
Oh, yes, sir. The bill before us, as you know, does not specify any enforcement mechanism. You're correct.
Very good.
The one I'm seeking suspension on.
Okay, well, I'm going to wait to see the amendment, and I'll reserve my questions for after that. Thank you for taking my questions. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator West, what purpose?
Questions of the author?
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Senator Hughes, I want to walk through the bill.
Sir?
And what is the definition of inherently superior?
Inherently superior. Now, if we're talking about the language that is used
in the bill,
the idea that any race, sex, ethnicity is inherently superior. The idea would be, and I think we would agree on this, as individuals, we are capable of making good choices, making bad choices. And what choices we make are what define us. We're judged by the content of our character. But the fact that I'm of a certain race or that anyone else is of a certain race does not define who they are, does not determine their destiny or determine the choices they make. There's nothing inherent about any one race that is superior or inferior to another.
Is there any problem under this bill teaching that has been espoused in the past as part of our history?
That should be taught, and this bill does not limit that teaching. As again, there have been dark, difficult things in our past where that idea was taught.
So there's no problem with teaching that?
No, sir, no problem in teaching that.
Okay. Is there a problem with a professor stating their opinion as it relates to, as an example, institutional racism?
No, sir, no problem at all with that. Free discussion of ideas, intellectual inquiry, academic freedom. As you know, not just as concepts, those are specifically set out in the bill to make sure professors can lecture, they can discuss, they can challenge students. That's all part of the process, and that is not affected by this bill. Okay.
As it relates to the issue of compelling, how is compelling being defined in this bill? And would you agree that different people could have different, I guess you could say, meanings associated with the word compel.
Yes, and of course, as you know, for just about any word, folks might assign different meanings, but as you know, if a term is in a statute and is not specifically defined, the normal and customary meaning is the one. And so compel means to use force, authority, or power to accomplish an end. It's one thing to have a student read or study materials, but it's a completely different thing to try to force a student to take a certain position.
Okay, let's just start with force. Give me examples of a professor using force.
Well, Senator, as you know, the professor is in a position of power over the student. That's necessary for the process to work. The professor can lecture about whatever they want to. They can have discussions with students. They can challenge the students. But again, if the professor is using that authority to compel a student to believe or take a certain position, that's the problem.
I'm asking, what would be an example of a professor using, quote unquote, that authority?
For example, if to get a good grade in a course, you must take the positions, you must hold to the same positions as that professor in order to pass or to get a grade. That would be one example.
Have you known that to happen?
I beg your pardon?
Have you known that to happen?
Yes. Well, yes, sir, I have. Well, how about this? There's been testimony that it has happened, and I think as folks look back and think about that setting, I think we can all see situations like that where that could take place. And again, the professor might have any number of views on the left or the right or the middle.
Okay, I'm just asking about, do you recall any testimony when you were laying out the bill concerning that?
There was testimony about the bill from a professor, as you recall, the distinguished professor from two respected universities, who talked about her experience in higher ed and her belief for the need for this bill. That's not the question I asked you.
Let me answer. Not the question I asked you.
I don't believe any students testified.
So you would agree
for or against the bill.
You would agree with me. There's nothing in the record about any student saying that any professor has compelled them to do anything in their classroom.
No,
that's the record, right?
No, that's correct. No students testified. That's correct.
So there's no evidence of compelling.
No evidence that they hear.
Is there any evidence of attempting to compel?
Senator, there was no direct testimony at the hearing. Go ahead.
Is there any evidence of attempting to compel?
Beyond the testimony offered by the professor and accounts along those lines, there was no direct testimony in the hearing.
So you're telling the members, as we consider this, there's no record, no evidence of anyone ever being compelled here in the state of Texas to, consistent with the definition in this bill?
Essentially, you and I each know that hearings are for asking questions, for presenting bills. We're not limited to the witnesses brought before the bill. It's not like an appellate court, as you know.
So the answer to my question is, there's no evidence. There's nothing that was brought before this body that shows compelling or attempting to compel.
Senator, the concept here is that academic freedom, presenting different ideas and challenging students' beliefs and stretching their minds, that's not just okay, that's what we're supposed to do, and it's specifically set out in the bill. But I'm answering your question, but not going beyond that to compel a belief or attempt to compel a belief. That's the idea.
Well, that's the whole reason that I'm asking these questions. There's nothing that we've heard other than some, political narratives that would even suggest that this is a problem in the state of Texas.
Senator, do you think it's okay for a professor to try to compel a belief? No. I'm just asking. We're friends. I'm asking.
If indeed I was shown that someone was compelling, a professor was compelling someone, no. But there's been no showing of that, Senator.
So we agree that would not be okay for a professor to do that.
So what you're saying, that this is a potential incident that has never occurred, because there's no evidence of it in the state of Texas occurring, and that we need to make this law just in case.
Senator, right? Senator, as you know, there's been a growing concern on college campuses along these lines. There have been stories about this in the media. There's been a lot of discussion about this. And the idea here is, let's find some common ground, because we can all agree, I think we can all agree, that we are for academic freedom. We are for lively discussions, but we are not for allowing professors to compel or attempt to compel a particular belief. And again, whether it's left, right, or center, or out of left field, whatever it is.
I'm listening to you, but here's the reality, too, is that we don't have any evidence of that. We have nothing at all, Senator. And you're the author of the bill. You have a right to bring evidence to show that it's a problem. It's a political narrative. That's what's going on, whether it's the left or the right. And you've said to the members of the floor, on the floor, that there's been nothing presented to show it's a problem in the state of Texas.
Well, Senator, as you know, the committee before the testimony before the committee by Professor Swain was one. You and she had a pretty lively discussion. She talked about her experience in higher ed in very respected institutions, multiple around the country.
Around the country, but
Go
not in
ahead.
Texas.
Senator, can we agree? Can we agree that academic freedom is important, but there's a line that professors should not compel or attempt to compel? I thought we'd be able to agree on this.
Well, we can agree that there was no evidence of any issues
So it's
concerning.
okay?
May I finish?
Please.
All right. There's been no evidence that any professor has attempted to compel students at our academic institutions in the state of Texas. That's all I'm saying. And I think you agreed with me that there was no evidence of that.
So is it okay? Would it be? Are you saying it's okay for that to happen? I would think we would agree on these concepts.
We would agree that if it occurred, okay, but it's not occurring. That's what I'm saying. And I think we agree on that, do we not?
Senator, there are accounts from universities across the country where this has been an issue in higher ed in recent years in particular. And that's really what this is about. We want to make sure that our institutions are where ideas are open and there are discussions and exchanges, but not where students are compelled or attempted to be compelled to take a particular position.
Well, okay.
And that's really what
Again,
this is about.
and again,
I don't think we disagree on this.
And I think we can go. I would say that if it's a problem in other states, they need to fix it in other states. It's not a problem here in the state of Texas. We don't try to fix problems in the state of Texas based on what's going on in other states, Senator. You know that as well as I do. But in this instance, because it's happening, you've had a couple of witnesses that come from around the country and say it's a problem, wherever they come from. It's not a problem here in Texas because we hadn't had anyone to say it's a problem in the state of Texas. And you had the opportunity to present any witness you wanted to.
Senator, as you and I know, the witnesses for the committee don't present the only record on the case. And as you know, there have been articles about Texas A&M, about the University of North Texas, about problems along these lines. I can give you the sites if you would like. There have been stories in the media about this happening. Students have come forward about this. But again, lest we lose sight of what this bill does, this says academic freedom, teach, discuss, stretch those minds, have those discussions. But the professors should not use their position of authority to compel or attempt to compel.
If that's a problem,
I think we
there's no
agree
problem.
on that.
Again,
I think we
you
agree
have
on that,
said,
Senator.
and we've gone over this 10 times. You've said there was nothing presented to show that this is a problem in the state of Texas. If there is a problem, but there is no problem because we have received no testimony in court. We say evidence. Okay, I'd move for a summary judgment on you, but that's a different deal. But there is no testimony that it's a problem in the state of Texas. The testimony is that it may be a problem in other states, but not in the state of Texas. Do you agree with me?
If you're asking about the one witness that testified before the committee, that's correct. Was there opposition testimony in the committee? I don't recall. You and I were both there.
Now, you say that the purpose, I'm on page 1 of the bill.
Go ahead.
You say that the purpose, a public institution higher educator must be committed to creating, on line 34, intellectual inquiry and academic freedom so that all students are equipped for participation in the workforce and the betterment of society, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so from that vantage point, this kind of ties into DEI a little bit too, doesn't it?
Well, Senator Creighton has a bill about DEI.
Oh, I understand that. I'm just saying it kind of ties into DEI.
That's not the intent of this bill, but the concepts, there are probably situations where the concepts come together.
That's what I'm talking about.
But it sounds like the part you're reading is what the bill says we should be doing about intellectual diversity and academic freedom. The bill says we are for that.
Keep on. Go ahead. No, go ahead. You're doing good.
No, I think we agree on that, but go ahead.
Well, we should have diversity at our universities, right?
Well, this is talking about, to be precise, I don't want to get away from the words, it says intellectual diversity, so that all students are respected and educated. It talks about intellectual inquiry, academic freedom.
What's intellectual diversity?
I beg your pardon?
What is intellectual diversity?
Different ideas, different kinds of ideas. be the use of the term as it's described here. Different ideas. We don't all believe the same thing. We don't all think the same way.
And the reality is we've got to make certain if we get different opinions from different sectors of the state of Texas, right? To bear on our university so our professors can then have intellectual meetings with them via the classroom in order to stimulate their development, to make them a better citizen and also a better person as it relates to our workforce, right?
So I think we agree on that.
Agree on that.
I think we agree on that.
That's why I'm saying there's the intersection between what you're attempting to do and DEI, because we're talking about banning DEI. I know that's a discussion for another day, but we have programs in the state of Texas that basically, recruit students, help them get through the maze of admission and the whole 9 yards in order to make certain that the phrase in your bill is frankly realized by the state of Texas on line 34. Intellectual inquiry and academic freedom so that all students are equipped for participation in the workforce. Okay, that's where it intersects.
Yes, sir.
And I'll save that debate for another day. But here's the deal. As you look at this particular bill, this bill contains language that mirrors other anti-truth legislation in various other states, frankly, that have been shot down not only by federal district courts, but also by appellate courts. Are you aware of that?
Senator, I'm not. I don't believe that's the case. I was present when this bill was drafted, so I'll take your word for it. But I can tell you, I was present when this bill was drafted. It's very simple and straightforward.
Are you familiar with the Stop Woke Act in Florida?
I've heard of it. I don't know any details about it.
Is it anything in that particular? Have you looked at that particular legislation?
No, sir, I have not.
You never looked at that legislation? Anyone on your staff to draft this legislation? That's what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, all right.
I think they normally look at ours instead of us looking at theirs, but I have not seen that. No one that I know has been involved with that.
Okay. Does an educator, I want to look at this, and I think Senator Menendez brought this up. When we look at the issue of compelling a student, do we look at it from the viewpoint of the professor or from the student?
Well, Senator, as a practical matter, you would look at the res gestae, to use that phrase you and I used earlier today.
You better tell them what res gestae is.
I just heard you say it. You tell me what
you're following me now. I want you to follow me this way then, okay?
All right. We look at the whole circumstances, as you know, the way it was said, the way it was heard, and when interpreting a statute. So if a professor is compelling or attempting to compel a student to take a position, that'd be a violation. So I believe we'd look at the whole situation.
Sure. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. That's my answer. Go ahead.
No. And again, I'm trying to. Who makes the determination as to whether or not a student has been compelled?
Well, Senator, for any statute that we put on the books, whatever it's about, it's got to be applied. It's got to be interpreted. We could ask that question about everything. Who decides whether somebody stopped at the stop sign? We could ask that about any bill that we pass, but we use the normal and customary meaning. And again, if we get that far, I've got a floor amendment that describes how the Board of Regents will put a system in place for complaints. It may answer some of your questions.
So then each Board of Regents would make the rules that would be utilized to make these determinations of whether a student has been compelled or not compelled.
Not unlike when we pass a bill and we say the agency shall implement rules, shall adopt rules to implement this section.
Right.
We're giving some
Right.
latitude to those different universities to implement.
And when we say an agency ends up having statewide jurisdiction. Each one of these boards of regents have jurisdiction over the institutions within their system, right?
Yes, sir.
So that could lend itself to contradictory application, correct?
Well, so no matter what we put in the law, it might be applied differently in different places. But the goal is to make clear rules that the universities will then apply.
So you agree with me, it could be applied differently in different situations?
As any statute we pass could be, yes, sir.
Well, if it's an agency ends up having statewide jurisdiction for the most part, and they promulgate rules that apply to the entire state.
But we
as opposed to this, it applies just to institutions within that particular system.
In the agency situation, we wouldn't know how every employee, every agent, every inspector is going to apply, but there should be some uniformity.
Therein lies the problem, the lack of uniformity. That's all the questions I have at this point, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Miles, what purpose?
Questions to the author of this
Do you
bill,
yield?
Mr. President?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you, Senator Hughes. Senator Hughes, would you agree that one of the purposes for our college campuses is to be a place of academic inquiry and exploration?
Yes, sir.
Glad to hear you say that. So could you explain how limiting what college professors can and cannot teach aligns with the answer that you just gave me?
Well, Senator, this bill does not limit what they can teach.
It's not about what they can teach?
No, sir, it does not.
Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Oh, yes,
further?
sir. Yes, sir. Under this bill, there's no effect on what a teacher can teach. They can teach whatever they want to, whatever ideas, whatever they want to present. Yes, sir. That's not limited.
So as you see this bill, it's just preventing what?
Compelling or attempting to compel a student to adopt that position that the professor holds.
All right,
That's the difference.
Before you go there, let me take one step back.
All right.
Can a professor still present information about topics on race with this bill?
Yes, of course.
Can they talk about topics on gender with this bill?
Yes.
Can they talk about topics of religion under this bill?
Yes.
And can we talk about ethnicity without being in violation of the provision that's in this bill?
Yes.
So if we can talk about anything we'd like.
Yes, sir.
Professors can, even if this bill passes.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay. Now let's talk about the word that we've all had conversation with Senator Menendez, Senator West, because the word compel is in your bill 4 different times. And I heard you give Senator West a definition. I think that was a red definition that you wrote, I guess, out of the Webster. I think you called it a general definition.
Yes, sir.
Would it be out of order for me to ask you what your personal definition of compelling is?
Yes, sir. To compel, to force, to use force to try to accomplish an end. So compel is a lot.
Force.
To try to accomplish an end. That would be compel. That's how I would intend it. I think the definition I quoted was, I want to make sure I got it right, to use force, authority, or power to accomplish an end. I think that's...
So if a professor comes into a class and all he talks about every day is race, 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 and he makes a good guy and a bad guy out of it, is that considered compelling?
Doesn't sound like it.
Doesn't sound like it? If a professor comes into a classroom and talks about religion, and we all know that we've got different types of religion and different beliefs, but if he only focuses on one and he judges them as one being good and one being bad, and he emphasizes on the one good, that he talks about that all the time, is that compelling?
It doesn't sound like it to me, no, sir.
Tell me what compelling sounds like to you.
So compelling, to compel a student or attempt to compel a student to adopt my belief, to say, if you want to pass my class, if you want to get a grade in my class, then you have to say this. You have to adopt my belief. That's the idea. That's an example of what we're talking about.
That might help clear it up for me. So if I come in and I say, you got to believe that the Catholic religion is the #1 religion in the world, That's compelling if you want to pass my class.
That's more like what we're talking about.
And if
yes,
you,
sir.
like, I think Royce hit
I'll
on
hold.
this.
I'll hold.
Have
You go ahead. I'll wait.
No,
You go
no,
ahead.
I'm good. We're good. I can talk and chew gum at the same time. So have you seen anywhere in the state of Texas where a professor has compelled a student to believe in one particular race being superior, or one gender being particularly superior, or one religion being particularly superior?
Well, Senator, as along the lines of what we discussed with Central West, there was testimony before the committee about higher education in different universities around the country. There have been media reports about Texas A&M, University of North Texas. So there have been media reports of things along these lines.
Can you enlighten us a little bit more? So, I guess I missed those.
I want to be clear. The idea behind this bill says that we're for academic freedom.
You're starting to sound like Senator West. Let me finish. I want to be clear. All
right. I'm getting there.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. The idea behind this bill, all those things that you talked about being taught, of course, those things are taught. Higher education is not the same as K through 12, right? We're challenged by different ideas to expand our thinking and to learn. You and I, I'm sure, read things in college we didn't agree with. We still don't agree with, but it helped us, right? It helped us form and defend our own beliefs. So that's preserved specifically in this bill. That's why it talks about academic freedom and intellectual diversity. But the line would be for a professor to say, you must adopt this belief. That's where the line is drawn in this bill.
So it sounds like your intent was to just to everything to be talked about, everything to be discussed, nothing to be hidden, but not to enforce or have a certain stronger persuasion over one position or the other. Is that what you're trying to do? Is that the intent of your bill?
I believe that's the lines, along those lines is what we're talking about. Okay. Yes, sir. I believe
well,
that's
somewhere along the way, the bill went a little stray because it's the way it's written now. It's just too broad. I mean, anything can go in here. It's just too broad. I think I'm hearing and trying to finally get an understanding where he's going. You just don't want somebody to make a student feel like you got to do this or else.
That's
Is that right?
Idea. That's the idea, Senator. That's the idea. That's what we mean by compel.
This is
or
right.
To compel.
And you need to know that this was wrong. You still want to allow them to be and have their own, make their own, and form their own decision and opinion on things. Is that your intent?
Senator, that's the idea. I think you're exactly right. And that's why we put in there intellectual inquiry and academic freedom, participation, intellectual diversity, so that all students are respected and educated. That's the idea. I think we're talking about the same. I think we're in the ballpark.
But I don't think, Brian, respectfully, Brother Senator Hughes, I don't see. I hear your intent, and I think I understand what you're saying. I think, but when I read this bill, it's not worded or written in the way that I'm starting to vaguely understand you. So let me give you an example. Could a professor, could you tell the difference between a professor assigning a reading of the evils of slavery and the virtues of civil rights movement, and that professor compelling their students to adopt a certain belief about slavery or civil rights under this bill?
No, Senator, of course not.
You could not?
No, sir.
Why not?
Well, that's not compelling or attempting to compel. And again, different ideas need to be presented. And
so if the professor gave both sides of slavery?
No, sir, we're not saying that. There are not both sides to slavery. I don't think. But go ahead.
Well, there's.
I don't think there are two sides to it. But go ahead.
There's a side that of people who, like myself and my ancestors, who were slaves.
Since I mean morally, there's not two sides. Forgive me.
You said what now?
I meant that morally there are not two sides to slavery. Forgive me. That's what I meant. But there's only one side
so you're
morally.
Correcting yourself now. Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
Then
Go
we'll
ahead.
go on.
You were saying.
I think Royce asked this question. I think Senator Mendez too, but it's probably the most important question here. Can a professor still share their personal beliefs?
Yes, sir. Now, I'm going to say this, and you tell me. The best ones, I believe, are going to put those ideas out there I think one of the best professors I had, this is an aside, all right, one of the best professors I had was political science. I happen to know, now having gotten to know him, that he was a lot more liberal than I was. But man, when he was presenting political theory, he would present left and right with zeal and gusto and with his heart. We really didn't know where he was sometimes because he presented them each. If we're talking about different political theories, and that's just one topic. But again, of course, a professor would present their own ideas. And especially nowadays with the internet and research, you're going to know a lot about the professor before you come to class. You're going to know what they believe, right? More than when you and I were in school. I'm older than you, but more than when you and I were in school, that information is available, I think.
Okay, so let me move on because I've got a little bit more here, members, President. Let's say I'm a professor, okay? So I want to make sure I'm clear when this is all over. So let's say I'm a professor, and I assign a reading on the civil rights movement. And I later share during the lecture that I believe those who fought to preserve Jim Crow laws and segregation were on the wrong side of history.
I would agree with you.
Can I teach that in my class?
Of course.
Do I have the freedom to tell children, young students that?
Of course.
Okay.
Under this bill, you sure would.
So that does not cross the line and be considered compelling or forcing a student to adopt a belief. That does not.
And to be precise, that's not even a social, political, religious belief. That's not even in that category. But yes, we agree. Of course, that will be taught. Should be taught.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you said that because I've got another example that may touch your soul a little bit. So Florida is making a similar push on the ban of teaching critical race. Am I correct?
Senator West talked about that. I've read about that on the internet, but I haven't seen the details of seeing the bill.
You know Florida's making that move. And their colleges,
I know their governor's been talking about it.
And it's already having a chilling effect on Florida.
I haven't heard, but I'll take your word for it.
The only black professor in sociology department at the University of Central Florida canceled 2 of his classes. The first class was Race and Society and Social Media, featured a unit on racial ideology and the color of blindness. The second was a Race and Ethnicity, which included a reading of the myth of a colorblind society. So it's already having a negative effect.
Well,
on Florida education.
And I haven't seen the Florida bill, but I bet it doesn't look like this. I haven't seen it, but I bet it doesn't look like this.
Okay. So I guess the answer to your question, my question I'm going to ask you is that you don't anticipate any classes being banned in Texas under this bill, do you?
No, sir. No, sir.
At Palm Beach Christian University, a school terminated an English professor who, as part of his class, taught a unit on the black experience. This included works by W.D. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and discussed racial disparities in incarceration and education. Would you expect the same similar purging of professors at the University of Texas with this bill passes?
Of course not. Not
Why
with
not?
this bill. And
What could be
I don't know about you, I read those men's writings when I was in school. I know you probably did too. No, sir, of course not.
You don't expect that. You're not anticipating.
No, sir.
What would be different from the Florida's CRT bill than ours? Because I wish I had Florida so I can compare it to ours, but it's still critical race theory.
Well, Senator, I was present when this bill was written in this building, and I haven't seen the Florida bill. I bet it doesn't look like this, and maybe we can see, but I bet it doesn't look like this.
You know, one of the problems I think is when we think of CRT, we always think of race. So let me give you another example that might hit and tell me if I'm right on line with you. What if the same professor, Boris Miles, what if I taught a woman's study course? Stay with me, ladies. And I have the viewpoint that women at one time were treated as second-class citizens in this country or in this state. And that has contributed to current issues for women when it comes to the wage gap and women's rights. Okay? If I now teach that women's movement has improved American society, would that be considered compelling a student to believe that women are superior to men?
No, sir. Of course not.
Okay. I'm sure all the ladies in the house are happy to hear that. We are already seeing documented instances of educators in the K-12 system self-censoring in Texas schools. You've heard about some of that, right? They're already censoring themselves because they're scared of what they can and cannot say. How will you prevent a similar chilling effect at the university level for faculty and students discussing certain topics about race and gender? How are you going to protect that, Brian?
That's a great point,
with
Senator.
this bill out there?
And last session, you and I had lengthy discussions about Senate Bill 3, about critical race theory in K through 12. We had lengthy discussions about that, and we talked on this floor, and we read in the bill where it says every element in the TEKS must be taught. And we talked about how Dr. King is there as many times as George Washington. We talked about how civil rights movement is there, how slavery, horrible things in our past, the Holocaust is there. That's all in the curriculum. Now, here's what I've found. Media stories saying false things about that bill, that probably is having a chilling effect. But that bill says we must teach the whole truth about our history. And you know that, Senator. You remember that. We were here.
You know, this bill is almost like, Royce, almost like the DEI bill. Mr. President, we have this discussion. It's almost like the DEI. Perception. The perception of DEI is that certain races of children are not wanted in state schools. That's perception. Perception of this bill is that you don't want to have conversations about one of America's greatest sins, slavery.
Well, Senator, there's nothing in this bill that says that.
You don't want the kids to understand.
If people would listen to what we've said today, and what Senator West and what Senator Menendez and you and I have said today, it would be clear that all those discussions are welcome. In fact, they're required by this bill. Intellectual diversity, intellectual inquiry, academic freedom. They're specifically required by this bill. Again, I'm sure there's going to be all kinds of stories, false stories about what's in this bill. And that may have a chilling effect. But Senator, this bill, let's create a better perception. Let's tell the truth. And you tell the truth. You always do. Let's get out the truth, what's in this bill, not what the media says about it. What's really in the bill. Come on, you know what I'm talking about.
Brian, what you intended to put in this bill, I've got to believe, and I want to believe because I've known you for some time.
We have.
Your heart might have been in the right place. But when you sat down and wrote the bill, this bill is too broad. You know, a simple misstatement in a college professor's classroom can cost that professor the job. But let me, because I'm almost finished, and I know some other colleagues would love to ask you questions. So let me ask you a question. So do you believe that some social beliefs simply are inherently superior to others?
I believe that some are true and some are false. If you're asking what I believe, yes, sir.
So social beliefs held by racist individuals are better than social beliefs held by people of color, or social beliefs held by monogamists that men are better than women, or that children with learning difficulties should be treated as less than those without learning disabilities, or that discrimination is better than inclusivity. These are all social beliefs held by many people. Would you agree?
Senator, I'm not sure.
Would you agree?
I'm not sure if I would.
Would you agree?
I'm answering your question.
Simple yes or
no,
no.
I would not.
Okay.
I don't believe racism qualifies as a social belief nor discrimination. Just so we're on the same page.
I heard you when you said no.
So we're on the same page.
I heard you when you said no. Respectfully, thank you, and I appreciate that. And I'm closing. The difference is that as a society, we've agreed that some beliefs like equality and races, fair treatment of women by men, the right to an education, regardless of your learning difficulties, and inclusivity, as opposed to discrimination, are inherently better, despite what you believe. The question is, What is the penalty if a professor violates the law and is then deemed to be guilty of compelling a student to adopt a belief? What's the penalty?
Senator, under the bill before us, there is no enforcement mechanism. If we get to suspension, I have a floor amendment that sets up a mechanism, and we can visit about it then, but where the Board of Regents puts a complaint process in place. And if you'd like, if we get that far, I have an amendment where we can talk about that. But it's not in the bill before us. There's no enforcement mechanism.
So there is no enforcement mechanism whatsoever. There is no penalty.
Without the amendment that I hope to offer. That's right.
Okay. And did we add the amendment already? Was I asleep at the wheel or something?
No, so we haven't added the bill hasn't been.
So we're discussing this bill for members to vote on, but we don't know what the penalty is yet.
We're voting on suspension of the rules, not on passage of the bill.
You want to pass the bill first before we even know what the penalty is?
No, sir, we want to suspend the rules to bring up the bill, then we'll talk about amendments. That's how we normally do it.
Okay. Okay. How are we preparing, Brian, Senator Hughes, the next generation to be a better society and continue to work the work of healing our deep racial wounds when this bill bans discourse in college classrooms around certain topics?
This bill specifically encourages discourse. That's in the higher education purpose. It says a public institution of higher education must be committed to creating an environment of intellectual inquiry and academic freedom. Discourse is what it's about. That's not affected by this bill.
You know, Senator Hughes, members, it's strange that almost all the legislatures opposing this bill are racial minorities. Why do you think that is?
Senator, I wonder, because if you look at the words of the bill, they're pretty clear, straightforward things that I think most all of us agree on.
I just asked the question. You didn't answer my question. I said most of the senators that are opposing this bill in this body are going to be racial minorities. Why do you think that is?
I wonder why as well, Senator, because the words of the bill are very clear, and they're things that I think we all agree on.
Okay, closing out. Senator Hughes, we must be careful, as I stated 2 weeks ago on this floor, not to continue to roll the hands of time backwards. This country, the state's original sin was slavery. And wanting to ignore it and erase it will not change the fact. Systematic racism in education, economics, healthcare, and housing are all branches that grew from this poisonous tree. There is a quote that reads, "If you don't learn from the past, you will condemn yourself to repeat it." Senator, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was just signed into law 59 years ago. That's just yesterday. The length of time that some of us have, just been on this earth. I'm just 57. We should be encouraging our college professors to challenge their students. And we should be encouraging our students to listen to different viewpoints. The truth can be uncomfortable, but that doesn't change the fact that it is the truth. I believe that dictating what can be taught to adult colleges and adult colleges, campuses, is a step just taken a little too far. We must not stifle our university's ability and fully and wholeheartedly to educate the next generation of Texans. As I tell my 11-year-old daughter when she leaves the house every day, be a leader, not a follower. We as Texans need to embrace our diversity and our history. That's what makes Texas strong. Thank you, Brian Hughes, Senator Hughes, and thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Johnson, what purpose?
Questions of the author?
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Hughes, I want to just explore the bounds of this bill, and there's been considerable discussion on it already, but I really want to hone in on it. So first of all, does the name Winston Smith as a fictional character ring a bell?
You'll have to help me out.
Yeah, he's a protagonist. I had to look it up myself. He's the protagonist in George Orwell's 1984.
Got it.
And we probably all had to read a very unpleasant book, and there's a especially unpleasant moment in the book when Winston is being tortured, and he's asked the question, I don't remember the question, it might have been 2 + 2 is 5. And he's being forced to lie, and they beat him and torture him, and finally he can't take anymore. And he just tells the lie they're asking him to tell, and they shock him again. And he's like, what are you doing, man? I just said what you wanted to say, and they said, you're lying. Now, when you say in the bill, nobody's allowed to compel a belief, you don't mean like the Winston Smith 1984. The kid still has a chance to write on the test whatever stuff the professor's saying, right? We're not really making them believe to the point of changing their minds in order to run afoul of this provision. It's something else, right?
So the example in 1984 is probably already against the law in other penal code sections that we don't.
We'll never mind the torture part. But you don't mean like compelling them to change their thoughts, or do you?
Well, Senator, that's the idea. We're talking about going beyond discussions, going beyond discourse, as Senator Miles and I discussed. We're talking about going beyond that, where the professor is using their position of authority, their power, to compel that belief, or to attempt to compel that belief.
So let me give an example, and you tell me if this would be compelling. They put a question on the test, and they say, essentially, if you don't regurgitate what the professor said in class, you're going to get a D. Would that be violative of the statute?
Well, depending on what that material was.
Let's assume it was a belief that one race is superior to another.
Senator, I think you and I know that the way, and you're an educated man, I think you and I know that in that higher education model where professors are presenting different ideas and students are having discussions, the idea is to lead that student to the truth, to come to the conclusion, not quite like the Socratic method, but along those lines. I think we agree that's what we think of the university
maybe
is
even
doing.
Different conclusions in a good education setting.
I beg your pardon?
I said maybe, I'm sorry to interrupt, and you were saying earlier you had this great professor who prevented both sides, and as long as the kids are understanding what they're saying, they shouldn't be graded on reaching the social or political conclusion that are being examined, right? And if a professor requires you to regurgitate what they said about race or religion or sex or some political or social or religious thought, you're violating this, right?
That's the type of compunction, attempted compunction, that we're talking about.
Yeah, good. Okay, and I hope you don't feel picked on it by this part of our discussion, because this is I'm just identifying that there may be a point when a professor is doing the wrong thing, and this statute is meant to capture those moments, right? The bad grade moment. But let's examine a different moment. What if professors teaching economics, and they're talking about capitalism versus communism, and they say to the student, pick a side. I don't care whether you're a communist or a capitalist, a liberal free enterpriser, or some sort of socialist big state person. Pick a side and defend it in your paper. Have they compelled the student to take a position or adopt a belief?
No, sir.
But they just told them, you got to take a position. Why is that not compelling them to adopt a belief?
That's not it doesn't say to argue for a belief or to advocate a belief, but to adopt a belief.
So to actually believe it the way Winston Smith does in 1984.
Or to attempt that end.
All right, so I think we're running into a little bit of a problem. Like, when are they requiring them to believe it, and when are they just requiring them to say it? And that's tough to draw that line, isn't it?
Well, in the example you gave, clearly the professor is saying, argue for this position, take this position. You probably had experiences like that. They want to teach you how to argue, how to analyze, how to make points, how to look at an argument from different standpoints, how to see the weaknesses in one's own argument. Comes in handy around here. I may be finding out today. So far, so good.
It's a good joke. Now, Senator Miles brought up the scenario where the professor walks in every day, just beating a drum on something, whether you like what they're saying or not what they're saying. Is intellectually bullying outlawed by this statute?
Well, Senator, discussions, lectures, reading different texts, being exposed to ideas I'm not comfortable with, that's part of higher education, right? That's part of the university.
As long as I'm not required to agree with them on the test, the professor's okay, right?
That's part of the idea. Or if there's a situation in class where a professor is so using their authority to berate a student, to compel a student in that way, those situations are hopefully rare. But I think we could agree that that would not be appropriate in a university setting.
Oh, I would agree, and I would agree that it's inappropriate without the bill, and they probably ought to be fired if they're just bullying their students. As distinct from a professor who say, I remember in law school, we had a socialist who said, in America, you're free to die under a bridge. And we had this extreme anti-socialist who used to say, happy, healthy greed is what runs the economy. And so we had these whipsaw personalities, and they were fantastic.
Yes.
They were two of the most sought-after teachers in the whole building by people who disagreed and agreed. We want that discussion. So if the bill doesn't preclude that, but it does go against the bullying that would probably follow them anyway, if it doesn't, if it's not barring a professor from requiring students to take a position, if it's not barring a professor from advocating a position, I think we come to the conclusion that the bill just doesn't do very much.
Senator, hopefully. In an appropriate higher education setting, this should not be happening too much. And as Senator West and I discussed, there's evidence of this in other universities around the country. There's a couple of news stories about Texas universities where this is an idea. And so we ought to be able to agree that intellectual diversity, academic freedom are important, but the compunction that you and I talked about, that's inappropriate. That's not okay. There's no place for that in Texas higher education.
So we've been through this exercise, and there's unanimity in the body about the purposes of a higher education setting. If it really is this limited in scope, we run into the question of whether it should exist at all, or does it just create more problems along the lines that other senators have already expressed today. And if it does pass out of this chamber and the House, I'll expect this discussion to inform how it's applied. And it really ought to not do very much. So I appreciate you going down this road with me.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Hoffman, what purpose?
Permission to question the author?
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Senator Hughes, I wanted to chat with you and ask you a few questions about your legislation. I've been sitting here carefully paying attention to the debate and listening to the members as they ask you questions. And I guess I'm thinking about the bill in a slightly different way. And as I listened to you lay out your bill and I listened to the debate, it brought to mind a bill that I carry that passed out of this Senate in 2009. It was actually Senate Bill 18, and it was the Campus Free Speech Bill. Do you recall that bill?
Remember that well. I was on your committee and proud to work on that bill. We had hearing on university campus, a lot of input from students. I remember that bill well.
And do you remember a part of the impetus for that bill and why we kind of got into it? And we did have hearings at different universities. It was because the students were not being allowed to exercise their First Amendment rights. Do you remember that? And they were not allowed to invite certain speakers. They weren't allowed to congregate in certain areas. They weren't allowed to express their beliefs. Do you recall that?
I remember that very well. I do, Senator.
And, you know, I'm happy to report that it appears that since we've passed this legislation, there has certainly been a big improvement on college campuses as it relates to the students' rights. And would you agree with that you have seen that as well and what you've heard?
It's been very encouraging. I agree.
Okay. And one of the things in SB 18 from 2019 was a statement that says it's a matter of statewide concern that all public institutions of higher ed officially recognize freedom of speech as a fundamental right. And we would all agree that even on our college campuses, there should be a freedom of speech, correct?
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
So a lot of that law was placed into Chapter 51 of the Education Code. And I noticed as I looked at your legislation that your prohibition on compelling certain beliefs also shows up in Section 51. And you wrote that legislation, you wrote this legislation, and we're now talking about the legislation before us, committee substitute to Senate Bill 16, correct?
Senator, that's right.
So I think it's quite logical that your language actually follows through with some of the campus free speech ideas. And also, like the previous bill, the campus free speech bill, your bill also makes some very meaningful statements about higher education's purpose, about how academic freedom, intellectual inquiry is so important. Intellectual diversity is important. Everything should be respected. Race, sex, ethnicity, or social, political, or religious background or belief. So like the campus free speech bill, there's sweeping language that sets admirable principles that we should all adhere to. Correct?
Senator, that's so right. And things like that, we've all just assumed that will be present in higher ed, but it's necessary to put it in statute because so many times free speech just isn't there. You're exactly right.
So I don't really see how on the first part, your first section, that anyone could disagree that these aren't admirable objectives that a state as great, as grand as Texas should have for all their educational institutions, all our institutions, whether it be, public ed, higher ed, all of them. So then following through on your next section, the one that's in the same section of the code as campus free speech, you make this statement that a faculty member of an institution of higher ed may not compel or attempt to compel a student, again, to adopt a belief, and it goes on to say what type of beliefs. To me, that follows perfectly with one's individual right of free speech, free belief, that a person who is in an authority figure, so to speak, like I think about professors or teachers in the higher ed institution as like an authority figure. Would you agree?
Certainly do. Yes, ma'am.
So to Senator Johnson's question as it went to intellectual bullying, I think he said he was against that. I'm pretty sure that's what he said ultimately. I would say intellectual bullying is compelling. I would also say intimidation is compelling. Threatening certain grades is compelling. So my point is, I believe part of your, and I'm asking you, part of your legislation envisions that a student has a right to certain beliefs. And yes, a professor can state beliefs and try to teach certain beliefs, but they may not compel or force a student to accept their own personal beliefs.
Senator, that's exactly right. Thank you.
So that's what this bill is, as I see it, it's very clear, as I see this bill, that's just another step in the process of a student's rights, that they shouldn't be compelled to get a certain grade or to be a certain, placement in the class or certain recognition in the class, that they be compelled to adopt a belief that they don't want to believe.
Senator, that's exactly right.
Okay. So I'm very supportive of your bill. As I said, I think it expands upon our notions of free speech and liberties, and thank you for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Gutierrez, what purpose?
Thank you. Just to ask a few questions.
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
You caught me by surprise, Mr. President. Oh, thank you. I thought we were going by seniority, so thank you for that. Senator, you always get all the tough bills. I don't know how you do it, but you do. I'm wondering, I'm not going to beleaguer the point, but you said that the enforcement mechanism is coming for us in an amendment, correct?
Senator, that's right. Under the bill before us, a university could do whatever they wanted to. The amendment would provide some guidance, some parameters, but the bill that I'm seeking suspension on doesn't specify any enforcement mechanism. That's right.
And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but are we talking about losing funding, firing people?
Senator, the amendment talks about the school setting up a system for complaints, reporting those, and good cause for taking disciplinary action against a faculty member should the violation occur.
What if a kid says, Professor Johnson, he compelled me to believe X, Y, and Z, and he files this student report with somebody. How would that process go?
Well, the school's got to set up a system to receive the report, to investigate, to determine whether the law was violated.
Should we have, so it basically becomes this he said, she said piece, right?
Well, Senator, if we're talking about class, there's going to be witnesses, for one thing.
Witnesses.
That would certainly help.
What if a group of kids didn't do so well and they all filed this complaint? They just didn't do well on the test. And they say, Professor Johnson compelled me to do something. Then what?
The university would have to determine whether the law was violated. Universities know how to deal with college students, know the process of higher ed, and so a University Board of Regents will set up a system to implement this.
Should we have cameras in classrooms to watch professors as they're teaching adults, young adults?
And that's not required by this bill. Many do because of online courses and things like that. I think that's pretty common, but it's sure not required by the bill.
Last week, you and I had a discussion on vagueness when it came to writing statutory construction. It was more specifically in the area of a criminal statute, if I'm not mistaken. And so you have been asked by several members of this body to define what it means to compel or attempt to compel a student. And so can you give me a definition of what you're talking about, to compel? And then at one point you said, if a professor says you must be this, do this, that's not really a definition, it's an explanation, but can you just define compel?
Compel means to use force, authority, or power to accomplish an end.
All right. It's to adopt a belief that any race, sex, or ethnicity, or social, political, or religious belief is inherently superior to any other race, correct?
Oh, yes, sir. I believe that's right.
All right. So, you can both agree that there are many classes in universities about race relations, correct?
Yes, sir.
You said law schools, but colleges have classes on racial relations.
Oh, yes, sir. And I mentioned law school because we often hear that CRT is only in law school. And I mentioned the resolution by the UT professors about the undergraduate campus as well. But yes, race relations, of course, are taught at the
critical race
undergraduate
theory,
level.
Critical race theory is also taught at the undergraduate level.
I believe it is.
Okay. Are you saying that a professor cannot teach critical race theory?
No, sir. We're saying that a faculty member cannot compel or attempt to compel a student to do what you just read a moment ago.
So
academic freedom is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you finished.
So academic freedom, as Senator Huffman and I mentioned, is specifically described in the student free speech statute as well as in this new statute, Section 50, about intellectual diversity, different ideas, different discussions, and academic freedom.
To your knowledge or recollection, and there was no testimony, by the way, as Senator Huffman asked you, you didn't have any testimony about any professor threatening certain grades to anybody, correct?
Yeah, no students testified in the committee.
And you would agree with me that the concept, or at least the coursework of critical race theory, one, it's a theory, right, about race, correct? And the critical part is asking scholars to think critically, to do some critical thinking, correct?
Senator, I believe, now again, as you know, critical race theory, that this bill is about compelling beliefs. Critical race theory, the critical part means that race is the defining principle in American society and that everything comes down to race. I think the critical race theorists would agree with that description, but I'll defer to you.
I don't know. You're a smart man. You're much smarter than me. Many scholars would argue that it's about a social and legal construction of race that advances the interests of white people sometimes, right?
I haven't heard that, but if you say so, I believe
at the expense of people of color. And so if a class like that espouse that, does that violate this law?
Well, Senator, unless a faculty member is compelling or attempting to compel a student to adopt a belief described here, then there's no violation. Academic freedom is specifically protected in this statute.
So if a professor posited that notion about critical race theory, that one of its principal positions is that race is a social construct that affects or benefits white people. That's not compelling anybody. That's just teaching somebody we're okay under this statute.
Clearly, under the words of the
This
statute, yes,
proposed
sir.
statute. If a critical race theory professor suggested to his class that we have highly disparate rates of incarceration with black Americans, African Americans, and that is an incident of white men that have created laws in this country, and I'm not saying you, I'm just positing this as a position that is offered in school in these courses, that those higher rates of incarceration for black men created by laws by white men to advance their interest against the people of color, does that violate this proposed piece of legislation? Because you would argue, you would agree with me that that is the case, maybe not the white people part, but you would agree with me that black and African American men have a higher rates of incarceration than any other ethnicity. You would
That's
agree
true. The
with
numbers
me.
don't lie.
I would even argue, many scholars have posited that President Nixon created laws on marijuana specifically targeting black men. You wouldn't disagree with that, right?
I haven't heard that, but if you say someone says it, I believe you.
And so those types of ideas wouldn't be inhibited by your statute here.
No, sir.
So in essence, we can go and teach critical race theory as long as we're not compelling anybody to believe it or adopt it.
Since this bill is very clear about academic freedom, intellectual diversity.
Okay, if a teacher teaches the reading of the bell curve, I'm not as astute as you. I read excerpts of this in my sociology class in college. I didn't read the whole thing. Are you familiar with the book called The Bell Curve?
Came out, as I recall it, I want to say early 90s, maybe it talked about affirmative action. I vaguely remember the concept. I didn't read the book, but I think I've heard of it.
Interestingly enough, it was dedicated to a man named Harlan Crow, which we've been reading about lately. But the bell curve basically said that African American men, and I know you don't believe this and I don't believe this, that African Americans had lower IQs and therefore couldn't do certain things in society. If a professor posited this idea to people as an example of bad ideas in our nation, that doesn't violate this bill.
No, sir, of course not.
Okay. If a teacher requires a reading of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, again, same sociology class, you know how professors are. Don't read the whole book, read this chapter, read this section. As a bad idea, essentially examples of anti-Semitism, does that violate the functionality here in this piece?
No, sir.
Some people have
Does not.
asked you about capitalism versus socialism or communism. And here it says that a professor cannot essentially ask you to adopt a position that one of those is inferior to the other. Is that accurate?
Well, Senator, not to adopt a belief that one is
Inherently
superior to any other.
Okay, so capitalism and communism are equals, essentially, is what that professor would have to.
Well, Senator, they could present. No, so they could present whatever ideas and present their views and different views. As far as compelling a belief, that's where the line would be.
Does this bill require that monetary theorists suggest that Bitcoin and greenbacks are equal?
Senator, they could teach anything they wanted to teach. Academic freedom is specifically preserved.
Okay. And if this bill requires theology teachers, because some of our public institutions in higher learning still have some semblance of theology courses, teach that Christianity is no better than Satanism or that Satanism is inferior to it. Would this be violative of this bill?
That's one of those ugly parts of free speech that Senator Huffman was talking about, and academic freedom allows professors to teach different ideas to students.
Okay. Well, and lastly, I would just want to suggest to you, so there's nothing in this bill that's, because free speech is important, and it's important to those students, But it's just as important to professors that are trying to provoke the minds of young people so that young people know that there's a pro and a con, that there's a right and a left. Right?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I think I'm with you. Go ahead.
And so there is nothing in this bill, and I want to make this absolutely clear, that would not allow a professor of any university in the state of Texas to teach the specific subject matter, critical race theory.
Well, Senator, the words of the bill matter: intellectual diversity, academic freedom, but compelling a belief or attempting to compel a belief that one race is superior, that's the problem.
Will a professor be allowed to teach critical race theory in our schools?
If they're trying to compel that belief, as we've discussed and as each senator and I have discussed, that's the problem. But academic freedom, intellectual diversity are specifically preserved under this statute.
So that would be a yes.
I'll stand on the words of the bill, Senator. That's my answer.
Be a yes, that we can teach critical race theory in our schools?
You heard what I said. You see what the bill says.
I'm just wondering, is that a yes or no?
Heard my answer.
What's your answer?
Mr. President, I've finished. I've answered the question. I don't know if he has any more, but I've answered that question. I don't know how many more times you want to ask it. The bill's very clear with what it says.
I just want to know the answer. Are we allowed, are professors in college university campuses allowed to teach critical race theory, yes or no?
Let me be very clear. Intellectual inquiry, academic freedom, intellectual diversity, all students respected. However, if we're talking about compelling a student to believe those tenets that one race is superior to another, that one sex is superior to another, that crosses the line under this bill.
But
that crosses the line. I don't know what your definition of critical race theory is, but that's what the bill says, and that's what I'll stand on.
You said it earlier. If a professor doesn't compel anybody, if we're just provoking minds to know that there's a black and a white, to know that maybe historically whites did this and this is how I feel about it, professor being I. How you want to feel about it, that's up to you, student. So I'm asking again, are our universities allowed to teach critical race theory in our schools?
Senator, I'm not sure what your definition of critical race theory is, but let me be clear. Under this bill, no student can compel or attempt to compel a student to adopt a belief that one race is superior. That is the heart of critical race theory, as many people see it. So I'm not sure what definition you're using, but I want to be very clear about this.
There's nothing in the coursework.
Senator Gutierrez, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. He's answered your question. He says multiple times. You've asked the question, he's answered the question.
Ask another question.
If it's a different question.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
It's your floor.
Thank you, sir. There is nothing in critical race coursework, race theory coursework, that says that we are asking a person to compel, or we're compelling a student to think a certain way. Is that right or wrong?
I don't believe that's right.
So you believe that critical race theory specifically compels someone to feel not to feel a certain way, to take a certain position. That's your belief.
My belief is that much of critical race theory does that. Again, that's why I asked you what your definition of critical race theory was. This bill says academic freedom is preserved, intellectual diversity is preserved, but we cannot compel or attempt to compel a student to adopt the belief that one race is superior.
And lastly, again, your position is that
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Your position is that CRT compels people to take a certain belief, and so therefore you don't want critical race theory taught in our schools. Is that correct?
Some critical race theorists take that position. I can't speak for everyone, but some of the ideas taught, as we discussed in Senate Bill 3 last session. But again, this bill clearly preserves academic freedom, but it does say that we will not compel or attempt to compel a student to adopt a particular belief, that one race is superior, that one sex is superior.
Yeah, I think your and my understanding of critical race theory and the rest of the countries are far different. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
President.
Senator. Senator Perry, what purpose?
Hey, Mr. President, ask the questions to author.
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you, Senator Hughes, and I'm listening here, and college is a teaching experience, and you learn different things in college. I heard this over and over again. There is no documented cases. I will tell you, even before CRT and all the other junk that's out there that we're having to deal with as we come to this legislature, There was a national recognized problem over a biology class at Texas Tech University. Someone was teaching the class and said, you'll either believe in evolution or not creation, or you won't pass my class. It was a high-profile case because that was going to be the difference of a passing grade that would keep a pre-med kid on his path. So this is not new. Professors get out of their box just like all people do. So there are cases. I will tell you, I have an email I speak to students at Texas Tech sometimes. I love talking to young people. They give you kind of a perspective that you need to be for being an old guy. But I'll read this. I won't state the class. It was a particular law school class. It was a pleasure to have you speak to our class yesterday. I've very much enjoyed Professor X. Not only has he helped us understand the legislative process, but he has brought in conservative perspectives, which I have not had access in my law school experience. So that's from a student at Texas Tech University. I have 4 others after I spoke that were thanking me because I brought a different perspective than what the system or institutional experience that they've been facing. So it's directly related to what you're saying. I think when students are isolated from all perspectives or are not exposed, it violates the inherent reason why we were supposed to have had a higher ed academia. And when I say college teaches a lot of things, I've had students tell me, we don't believe a word that guy is saying, but in order to get out of this class with the grade we need to move forward in life, we're going to write down whatever he wants us to tell us. Is that one of the last lessons that institutions these days? Because that's what I hear.
You're not the first one to say that, Senator Perry. That's
so
right.
I would just say it this way. Clearly, and I look back over my college tenure, I had a political science professor. We didn't agree on anything. But he really didn't care about my position as long as I came ready to debate the position. And that's what college is. On these soft subjects, what I call them the social subjects, the abstract subjects that have no right or wrong, usually from whichever perspective you're sitting on. I mean, we as a Christian, I know where I believe what right and wrong is, but that's my belief. That's not my professor's belief, possibly. But on those subject matters, it's the professor's job to throw those out there and not grade you on the answer, but how you got there. Critical thinking, process, facts. How do you document where you're going from? Because those are the critical thinking skills that get you down the road. 2 plus 2 is 4. It's not an abstract concept. I know Senator Johnson a while ago said something about, if a professor throws out, give me socialism and capitalism, and you take a position on it, why isn't that not compelling? Well, it's not compelling because the student got to pick which subject matter they wanted to support. If he had said, you're going to support this position and tell me why it's right, and if you don't tell it the way I want you to, you get a D in the class, that's compelling. But if you say, go pick either side, I don't care which side you're on, but you get to pretty much advocate from a position of research, strength, advocacy, then that's not compelling. That's what we want out of our professors. So I just tell you to say we don't have us documented, and we really do. They're out there. But it's going on. It's happening. Students have learned how to play the game. And what a waste of a lot of money to know that all I did is tell that guy up the class that dictated where I was going to be in pre-med, pre-law, or somewhere in a top graduating class for an Arthur Anderson at the time or some other Big Four accounting firm interview. My grades got me in there. I have to just say what that person wants me to say to get along, and I think there's more of that than we would like to acknowledge. So your bill's a good bill. From the way I hear it and see it and the way you're explaining it, and Senator Huffman put it out there pretty well, it just allows the professor to teach anything they want to teach, and as long as they're not telling that student what they have to come up with on the solution, or the answer has to be their answer, the professor's answer, it's okay. Is that a fair statement?
Senator, you said it very well even at the beginning of your remarks when you talked about appearing in front of those students and giving them a perspective that they hadn't had before. As you know, that's what higher ed's about, exposing students to ideas from across the spectrum, some that they agree with, some they disagree with, but the professor cannot use their power, their influence, their position of authority to compel a student to adopt that belief. Thank you. You're right.
Before I leave you alone, I know Senator Whitmer also says put a face on it. We have a lot of closet conservatives in the professor ranks. I know at Tech we do. They're a little bit more out than most of them. But I was actually speaking in 2013 whenever Sanctuary City was going on. I think I talked to a class, and it was a little bit dicey. I'll be honest. Some of the kids were pretty much reading the press and figuring out what they thought the bill was doing based on press and stuff. But after that conversation, this individual, this probably 20-something, 18, 19, 20-something, came up to me and she said, I've read about you. I'm not a fan of your politics. But now that you've talked to me as the bill author for what Sanctuary Cities is really doing, I'm actually supportive of it and would vote for it if I was sitting in your shoes. So isn't it fun to see people that are in that learning environment be able to actually move based on conversations and information that they get rather than having it given to them from a professor who says you will think this or a media report that you will believe this. That's what I consider one of my high points, I guess, in a classroom setting the last 15 years or so, 10 to 15 years, to where students were paying attention. And I had one came up and said, you totally changed my mind on what the bill does, and I'm supportive of what it does based on that. So that's what the higher ed experience is about. I will tell you that professor is one of those closet conservatives. She didn't advocate up or down for me as I stepped in there. She let me take the shots, and but we need that open dialogue with student and professor to grow the next population of thinkers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Perry.
Senator Middleton, what purpose?
Will the author yield for questions?
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you, Senator Hughes. I think you did a great job describing what this bill is really about, which is academic freedom, right? I mean, that's your goal here.
That's right, Senator.
And, academic freedom is something that really our universities were always known for, right? It's that diversity of thought that your bill intends to foster and grow in our system of public universities, right?
That's exactly right, Senator. The idea that is part of higher education, it's the very essence, academic freedom, intellectual diversity, being challenged, exposed to different ideas. That's right.
And, that's something that usually, when we're talking about the other side of that, where people do not feel, or students do not feel free to express their views, that perhaps something negative will happen, scholarships, grades, other social issues that could potentially happen. But, we've tried to measure recently this level of freedom of thought in our public universities. And, I've seen things out there that said up to 80% of our higher ed students are fearful and feel like they've had to censor, I guess that's a better way to say it, not fearful, but feel like they've had to censor their sincerely held beliefs or their ideology or what they truly believe about a particular issue. And I know that number is shockingly high. Actually, 80% is a lot. I mean, if only 20% don't feel that way, then you're definitely addressing a huge problem that we've got in this bill. And I know you've heard from a number of people about this, right? Students, professors, administrators in our public universities.
Senator, that's right, and the problem has been growing, and as you described, it's the opposite of what we ought to have at the university setting, where students are expressing their views and students learn from one another as they have discussions. But when that percentage of students are chilled or afraid to speak out for fear of retribution, it's a real problem. You're exactly right.
Well, and the downsides of that, you know, that we've seen before is where a student potentially is afraid to identify their ideology or what they truly believe in for fear that somehow their grades will suffer, right? And that's one of the key components of what could happen if they're compelled, right, that the bill addresses.
Senator, that's right. That's that ultimate power that professor has, which they can wield over a student. That's right.
Where they feel like they have to adopt the professor's ideology, or something negative will happen. There'll be some negative consequence. But something maybe even worse than that, where a student could potentially feel like they have to pretend to adopt the professor's view for fear of some negative consequence, right? That's another way that they could be compelled, potentially.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And, you know, that's why this bill is so important, because I'll tell you personally, there were times at UT Law School where I had professors where I felt like, and I didn't ask them this, but where I felt like, and it's up, you know, this is the intent of the student, right? And how the student feels, because that's what this is about, is that academic freedom, that freedom to express your ideology and your sincerely held beliefs. There were times where I felt like perhaps my grades could suffer if I identified that I was conservative. And that's the exact thing that we're trying to prevent with this bill, and that's why it's so important. We shouldn't have any student in this state feel that way and feel like there should be any negative consequence at all. We're not telling anyone what to think with this bill. We're just telling them you're free to express your beliefs, and there should not be a negative consequence if that's the case. The same way with the professors as well. We're not forcing any particular belief. We just want professors to foster that freedom of thought and that academic freedom, right?
Senator, that's exactly right. That's what this bill's about.
Thank you for bringing this. I think it's critical to the future of the state, because one of the quotes that I've heard of opponents of this particular policy, not this particular bill, is they said academic freedom causes curricular trauma, which is a ridiculous statement.
That's
and should not be tolerated in the state. So thank you for bringing this bill.
Thank you.
Members, the motion is on suspension. Secretary, call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Bardwell, Blanco, Campbell,
19
Creighton.
ayes. Oh, I'm sorry. Senator West? I'm already in the vote. I'm sorry.
I thought my light was on, but it was not on.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm in the vote. Let me suspend and I'll come to you.
Okay.
Secretary will finish calling the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Bardwell, Blanco.
19 ayes, 12 nays. The rules are suspended. Chair lays down on second reading committee substitute for Senate Bill 16.
Committee substitute Senate Bill 16 relating to the purpose of public institutions of higher education and a prohibition on compelling students enrolled at those institutions to adopt certain beliefs.
For what purpose, Senator West?
I had a question of the author, briefly.
Senator?
Of course, I'll yield.
Okay, a couple of things. I know that I feel compelled to ask you these questions. Okay.
But you can't compel me to adopt a particular belief in the process, but go ahead.
Well, you're right about that. Okay.
Nor are you.
Senator Huffman mentioned Senate Bill 18 in 2019. That bill, we had a lot of student input on that bill. We had students come down and testify concerning the issues that they were facing on campus, correct?
There was a hearing held on campus, and that increased the number of students considerably testifying.
Right. But we'd had no students come here and testify for this bill.
We didn't have this one on campus, no, sir.
Nor did we have any students come to the Capitol to testify, correct?
Well, Senator, we also realized that for the very matters that Senator Middleton and Senator Perry discussed, students would have reason to fear testifying for a bill like this if they're under one of these situations.
So the answer to my question is, I'm correct. No students came and testified.
You are correct. For or against, you're correct.
Right. And no students even said that they felt that they couldn't come testify for fear that there'd be repercussions, correct?
What do you mean in testimony before the committee? The only,
Right, no, I mean,
the only ones that testified were people that came.
I'm talking about,
testified.
did any students come to you to say, listen, I'm in fear of coming to testify about this bill because there may very well be repercussions?
I had at least one student tell me about an experience they had at a university just down the road, actually the university where we had that hearing back in 2019, talking about how they were in a situation like this. And there have been stories in the media, but no, nobody told me I'm afraid to come testify.
Okay, so I just want to get to intent because I know we need to move forward. It's the intent of you as the author of this particular bill that we make certain that no student is compelled to adopt a belief that a race, sex, or ethnicity, et cetera, is inherently superior. That is your intent?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that intent is, as it relates to compelled, you would agree with me that we've talked over and over again about what compelled is, and that in most instances, the power to compel is tied directly to the grade that a professor could give a student. Would you agree with that?
Senator, that's one example. Senator Johnson and I also talked about the situation where a professor in class lecturing can bully that student and wield that power. We talked about that example as well. Those are two primary ones that have come up during our discussions that I recall. If there's more, you tell me.
And no, you're the man. You're the man. And the reality is that we don't have any students that ever said they've been bullied here in the state of Texas or compelled in the state of Texas as relates to what this particular bill's intent is, correct?
No students testified before the committee. We've established that. You're correct.
All right. I just want to make certain that your legislative intent is manifested. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator West. Senator Menendez, what purpose?
Questions of the author on the amendment?
Well, we haven't laid out the amendment now. Let us do
I
that.
just had it in front of me. Thank you.
Members, there is an amendment. Secretary will read the amendment.
Floor amendment number 1 by Hughes.
Lay out your amendment first, then you can respond, Senator Menendez, or ask a question. Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, we had a lot of discussion about what this looks like. As Senator West and I were just discussing, as Senator Johnson discussed, this is serious conduct. If a professor is compelling or attempting to compel a belief, wielding the power of the grade, bullying a student, using that kind of authority in the classroom. And so we talked about the result. Under the bill as filed, it's just left up to each school. This amendment gives some guidance. It does a couple of things. For one thing, it says they'll establish a system for students to make complaints, and they can investigate those complaints. It says they report to the legislature and the Higher Education Coordinating Board annually on those complaints received. And if it's found a professor has violated this, if they violated this on line 9, 10 through 11, if an institution of higher education determines that a faculty member of the institution has violated this section, the institution shall discharge the faculty member. Then at the bottom, lines 25 through 28, for purposes of subsection C5, good cause for taking disciplinary action against a faculty member, including revoking tenure, includes their violation of this section. As we've discussed, for a professor to wield that kind of authority against a student is a big deal. It's not appropriate, and this amendment puts a remedy in place if a professor violates this law. And I move adoption of the amendment.
Forgive me. Senator Menendez, what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. President. Questions of the author on the amendment?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Hughes. Senator Hughes, I was reading the amendment, and it was interesting because in your bill layout, you read first letter D, that the higher education shall develop and implement a system to receive complaints. Then you went on to talk about the reporting, and then finally you said if someone determines a faculty member has violated the section, they shall discharge that faculty. But in your amendment, it has the firing under section C before, and does that make a difference in the implementation of this? Because it seems like in your amendment, as I read it, the first thing I read was, an institution of higher education determines that a faculty member of this institution has violated this section, the institution shall discharge the faculty member. And then after that, letter D, they shall develop a system to implement. It seems like you're going to fire the faculty member before you implement the system and before you're reporting. Does that, in your amendment, is this just a drafting error, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, sir. This is the way Ledge Council drafted, and C, D, and E are all there. There's not a numerical
Priority.
sequence to them. They all have to be done. I mentioned the board developing the system because there were a couple of questions, I think maybe from you and Senator West and Senator Gutierrez, about how it will be implemented. So I mentioned that first, and I hope I didn't confuse things, but all those things have to be implemented under the amendment.
And so because there are areas that are I don't understand in terms of how we would get around facts. And I guess my concern would be following the lines, if you are a student and you feel that you didn't make the right grades, or what about this? What if the major that you're trying to achieve requires that courses, let's say in maybe gender or racial studies, are part of that course study, so you're compelled to take those courses in order to receive that major? Does that fall under this legislation? Would you have the ability to file something against the person who created the course requirements for that major?
Well, no, sir. It's a great question. So in the bill on line 145, a faculty member, so it applies to faculty members.
Yeah.
And then it talks about compelling a student. So that's clear the conduct. It's prohibition on compelling certain beliefs. So it's about faculty members and students.
Okay. So if you ask a question about the disproportionate rate of maternal mortality in black mothers in our history, and we all know that there's a disproportionate rate of maternal mortality amongst black women in Texas, and that's part of the exam, and you choose to say no, that you don't believe that, and you get the answer wrong and maybe not the grade that you want, would that student have the ability to make a complaint against the faculty member?
Well, Senator, the professor would not be violating the statute in the situation you described. As you know, that's not a social, political, religious belief. The numbers are the numbers. That's just bare facts. Those are objective facts.
Okay. So I heard an exchange between you and Senator Milton about academic freedom and freedom of speech and being protected in these, all of the instances would not, it seems to me there are instances that would not be protected. Are there any specific examples of instances the bill would prohibit? Is there any prohibition in terms of your legislation? And I think, Mike, you're telling me that you're trying to get to the point where they can say whatever they want as long as they don't try to compel the student. Is that what you're saying?
Senator, that's right, and that's why we have the specific language about intellectual inquiry, academic freedom, intellectual diversity, and as you know, I'm reading from the bill. Mm-hmm. That's important. I know we agree on that.
So you have here, the governing board of the institution shall develop and implement a system to receive the complaints. And who gets to decide? Who's the arbiter of the complaint being a valid complaint?
Well, Senator, the institution of higher learning makes that determination. And so each institution will have authority to administer this and develop their own processes.
But you don't prescribe. Is it one person? Is it a group of people? Is it a panel? How does that work?
Well, Senator, it's up to the institution.
Okay.
And as you know, there are already processes in place for faculty complaints, for grievances. So universities already know how to handle these matters. So that's why this is not overly prescriptive. It just leaves it up to each institution to yes, sir.
Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator West, for what purpose?
Question of the author.
Do you yield, Senator Hughes?
Of course I'll yield.
Senator, in your amendment, line 12, 15, I think the governing boards of each institution of higher education shall develop and implement a system to receive students' complaints, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, sir.
Would you entertain an amendment to this particular amendment to make it a better bad bill?
So far, so good. All right.
And the amendment would be having the Higher Education Coordinating Board, for consistency purposes, developing it and make it applicable to institutions of higher education.
So rather than each institution have its own rules, we would direct the Higher Education Coordinating Board to develop rules implemented across all institutions. Is that the idea?
And make it applicable.
Yes, sir. That sounds great to me.
If you give me a few minutes, I'm going to have my staff work with your staff on that amendment.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay, we still have some questions. Senator Huffman, for what purpose?
Question the author of the amendment.
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Senator Hughes, just a couple of questions. Actually, Senator Menendez asked a couple that I have. So looking at your amendment, so do you envision both a student could bring a complaint, but also someone at the institution of higher ed or someone from the public? I'm not sure, because C is kind of general, and then D talks about how to receive student complaints. So,
Senator, that's right. And as it's drafted, the idea was student complaints, but that might be something good to put in Senator West's amendment if he's agreeable, amendment to amendment, to make sure that what do you think? We would not be limited just to students. If someone else in the university community were aware.
Perhaps another professor was aware of it, but
yes,
they should not be, I don't think they should be precluded from making a complaint, rather, because sometimes I think even in the best of situations, students can feel intimidated. I think we've seen that through this process, that they still feel like if they're the ones that complain, that somehow that will work against them in future classes or with future professors. So I don't know exactly how to fix it. I didn't know if the language was kind of broad, so that's why I was questioning you what you envisioned.
Senator, that's right. The thinking had been student complaints, but as you say, for the very discussions we've had, there may be a chilling effect on students, and so professors, university employees certainly ought to be allowed to. Again, I don't want to presume. We might ask Senator West to put that in his amendment to the amendment.
Okay. My other question would be, did you envision the universities, when they set up this process, that they would have some kind of appeals process? And I was thinking that would be an advantage for both the student and the employee professor, perhaps, but maybe that's already in the process.
Senator, that's exactly right. As you know, there are processes for complaints against faculty already existing, and so the thinking is the university is in the best position to develop those rules along those lines they already have. But with Senator West's amendment, that'd be done by the Higher Education Coordinating Board. But yes, you're correct.
And certainly then, just to set up, it would be your intent for there to be an appeals process for both parties in this process.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Only upon final determination would this take effect. That's exactly right.
Right. Or a student who felt like they were compelled, in fact, but felt like the university wasn't really listening to them, that they could, if they really felt strongly about it, could proceed through the appellate process.
That's exactly right, Senator.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Senator.
Senator Eckhart, what purpose?
To ask questions of the author.
I'm always looking your way. Remember, I'm always looking to my left now. I'm trying to get over there. Okay. Do you yield?
Much. I appreciate it.
Do you yield? Oh.
Mr. President, of course I yield. I just worked on that amendment. I apologize.
Oh.
Yes, of course I'll yield to Senator Eckhart.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Hughes. I'm looking at the amendment, and I'm also looking at the specific provision of the bill as proposed, the social and political belief. So let me just take a hypothetical to tease out the answer to this. Let's say a professor in the Macomb School of Business clearly and compels, in a compelling fashion, teaches that a free market economy is superior to a socialist based economy, that it's inherently superior. And compels, sort of along the same example that Senator Perry gave, compels his students or her students to pursue research in that class through that lens. Try on this lens. I compel you to explore free market economy as an inherently superior social form over a socialist-based economy.
So, Senator, I believe most of us here probably believe the evidence shows that free market economies are better, get better results, most good for the most people. In the situation you described, of course, a professor can walk a student through that, can make a student study that. But if we're talking about compelling a belief, the kind of coercion, compunction that Senator Johnson talked about, that Senator West and I talked about, that would be the line. But teaching that this is better, look at it from this viewpoint, isn't this great? Look at all the evidence for capitalism. We would expect teachers to teach that, but not to compel a student to adopt a belief or to attempt to compel them to adopt that belief, if that's what you're saying.
So you're saying that capitalism is a compelling argument, but the teacher cannot compel a student to adopt that belief.
Senator, that's a great play on words. That's not exactly what I had in mind, but certainly some arguments intellectually are more compelling than others. But for the professor, for the faculty member to compel, to use that power, either of the grade or of that force in the classroom during a lecture to bully a student, that's what this bill's about.
So if Professor Jim does compel student John to believe capitalism is a superior social form, does that run afoul of the bill?
Senator, if you are using the term as it is in this statute, to force, to use power, to use authority, to compel, to force a certain end, that's a problem. Of course, ideas are powerful, and all those ideas ought to be presented, and you and I believe that if we do that, we're going to get to the right place, that everything's presented, the truth's going to come out, we're going to get to the right place. But not because a professor is compelling or cudgeling us to believe, to adopt a certain belief.
So some subjects compel belief, and what this bill is about is professors compelling belief.
Well, Senator, different ideas are going to be more appealing to different people. But here we're talking about a professor using force, using power, using authority to compel. That's the idea here.
So let's say some student who's really an adamant believer in socialism reports this professor for compelling student John to adopt a belief in a capitalist social structure. And he takes that complaint to the institution of higher education. The only sanction, this says that the university shall discharge the faculty member. Is there any other sanction available under this amendment?
Well, Senator, the amendment says that if if the institution determines that a faculty member has violated this section. It's not based on a bare allegation, but if they find there's been a violation. Now, the amendment Senator West is preparing and Senator Huffman will put this system developed by the Higher Education Coordinating Board. But yes, if there's a violation, then that's the result. But again, every allegation is not going to result in a finding of a violation, obviously.
But if Professor Jim has compelled John to believe in the inherent superiority of capitalism, the only sanction available is to discharge Professor Jim.
If it's used force, authority, power to accomplish that end, that's not the same thing as a discussion, as a lecture, as a research project, as a required reading. It's beyond that. It's beyond the pale of academic freedom and what we expect in a higher education setting.
Would you entertain a progressive sanction, or is termination the only sanction that you will tolerate?
Well, Senator, from our discussions today, it's become clear that this type of conduct, bullying a student, using that force that you have in front of the lecture hall and berating a student on a point like this, toward this end, using the power of the grade, that's extreme conduct. This is not run-of-the-mill stuff. This isn't a professor challenging ideas and putting different ideas in front of students. This is something more. And if this is happening, it's serious. When this happens, it should be addressed.
But as you've heard in the back and forth, there appear to be two areas of vagueness with regard to your proposed bill. One is in regard to the definition of compel, and the other is in regard to whether it is the professor that's compelling the belief or whether it's the subject matter. Because in your exchange with Senator Menendez, or actually it wasn't Senator Menendez, it was Senator Gutierrez, you seemed to be opining that some subjects were compelling belief in inherent superiority.
Well, sir, let me be clear. Under the statute, on line 145 and 146, a faculty member of an institution of higher education may not compel or attempt to compel. So to be clear, that's the conduct this bill's about. As we discussed with Senator Johnson and Senator West, that professor that's using that power, that authority inherent in their role over the student to compel. That's the idea. It's the professor compelling, the faculty member compelling, whether professor or lecturer.
Is Professor Jim compelling a belief in the inherent superiority of capitalism, or is it the subject matter of capitalism that is compelling? Which is it?
The example you gave was not the professor compelling under the statute.
The example that I gave was not the professor compelling?
That's correct. That didn't sound like it to me.
Okay, then let me restate my example. A student who ardently believes in socialism is told by Professor Jim, you will believe in capitalism or you will not pass my class.
I thought you said the student was told you must research through this lens. I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood. I thought you said they're going to be made
plainer. You will research through this lens because it is inherently superior.
Senator, presenting different ideas is academic freedom, as you know, intellectual diversity, that's important. It's specifically set out in the bill. But if the professor is using their power, that ultimate power of the grade for a social, political end, or compelling a student in the way we described with Senator Johnson, that berating a student in class, that's something else. And that's what we're talking about here.
So again, my question is with regard to the amendment. Will you entertain a sanction, a level of progressive sanctions, a stair-stepping of sanctions, or is termination, as is laid out in this amendment, the only option?
Well, Senator, as I understand it, from even what we've discussed today, this is extreme conduct. If a professor is using...
I think I have my answer.
If a professor is using their power to compel in the way we describe, that's serious, and that's why termination is the remedy that we have in the amendment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Miles, what purpose?
Questions to the author of the amendment.
Yes.
Of course, I'll yield.
Expressing different ideas, and positions, and opinions learning, inquiry, and exploration. All these are things of the basics of our college campuses, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if I've got a kid, I'm going back to Professor Miles. So if I've got a kid that comes in my classroom and the kid has this outlandish belief, I don't know, that women are inferior or that blacks are inferior and that, you know, as history once said, we weren't human beings, we were products. I mean, we were, you know what I'm saying? If this kid has that belief, can I be found guilty under this bill if I just try to educate and redirect this kid that we're all human beings? Just because you're born of African or native does not mean that you are cattle, but you are in true a human being.
Senator,
and that women are just as bad. Let me finish, and I'm gonna give you. Okay. Let me finish. Let me finish.
Do your hand like that?
Let me finish.
There you go.
And that women are human beings as equal as men. So, as Professor Miles, do I stand? Am I running the possibility of being guilty, or at least being accused? Because that's a fine line. Compel, and just trying to educate, and you know, a misdirected youth. Because let's face it, when we were that age, there's a lot of things that we don't believe now that we believed back then. You agree?
Oh, yes, sir.
So, could I be in jeopardy as Professor Miles if I'm just trying to redirect this young man to understand that this is not, young man or woman, that this is wrong?
No, sir. Under this bill, you would have no concerns at all under this bill.
Okay, so then what in the situation, and this can happen, what if a kid gets sideways with a professor and just doesn't like something that the professor said? Or the kid didn't finish an assignment and he really doesn't want that bad grade on his, and they have differences. So the kid makes a claim on this. You're saying the professor can't be fired, but there will be an arbitration of some sort, or there will be investigation into it?
Well, Senator, already a student can complain about a professor already today. That's nothing new here.
Yeah.
A student can already complain about a professor, so we're not creating anything new. But if, in this situation, if a student and a faculty member have this interaction, and the faculty member is found to have compelled, to abuse their power, as we discussed.
Which is a fine line. Compelling and educating, I find and kind of redirecting a kid there, that's a really fine line in the sand.
Well, the examples that we've come up with during our discussions that have been pretty clear are that situation that Senator Johnson talked about, where that professor is berating that student in class and is using their power in that way.
I understand bullying.
All right,
I understand that, but
there's that. I'm answering, and then there's the question of using the power of the grade, that power the professor has over the student. Those are the two situations we've talked about that most of us seem to agree would be compelling. That's beyond the pale of just lecturing, just discussing, just trying to convince somebody. That's beyond that, and those are the type of activities we're talking about.
So let me ask a question that I'm sure Senator West would like to ask you, but I've got the mic right now. Did you ever call this bill a CRT bill?
This bill is oh yes, I believe I have.
Did you ever call this bill a CRT
yes,
bill, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Why?
Because this concept we've seen in higher education, as we said, it's not just in law schools, it's in higher education, it's in K through 12. And you and I talked about the CRT bill before, and that teaching that one race is superior to another or inferior, or that one sex is superior to another or inferior. These are the concepts we're talking about.
So this bill just doesn't have to do with race, though.
Sir?
Does this bill it's not singly having to do with race?
No, this is about race. This is saying that one sex is superior, one ethnicity, etc.
Okay. Do you think the proper name for this is a CRT bill?
Well, Senator, it's Senate Bill 16, prohibiting discrimination in higher education. CRT is a shorthand way to refer to the bill. These concepts are there. That's the idea, but it's about discrimination in higher education. As you know, Senate Bill 3, let me just say, Senate Bill 3 2 years ago, it didn't have the term CRT, but it was about those concepts.
Respectfully, Senator Hughes, I think you might have did yourself an injustice. This is more of a bill about freedom of speech than critical race theory.
It's definitely about freedom of speech. I appreciate that.
Are we still waiting for that one amendment, the amendment to the amendment? Yes. Yes, Counselor.
May we approach for a second?
Yeah, yes, you may.